Hey there, Legal Tea listeners. This is your host, Jenny Roselle. We are back to Estate Planning of the Rich and Famous, where we chat about celebrities and their estate planning. Today's episode is on Frank Gifford. Now, some may know and remember Frank from his professional football days playing on the Giants, while others may know and remember him as Kathy Lee Gifford's husband. Regardless, today's episode is on him and what happened following his death estate-wise. And as we always do on these types of episodes, we are going to start with going into Frank a little more personally and professionally, and then shift into what transpired with his estate following his death. According to his Wikipedia page, Francis formally, but Frank, hailed from Santa Monica, California. After Frank's death, his wife Kathy shared that he grew up in a very poor home, and Frank and his family, before Frank even attended high school, lived in 29 places due to his father unable to find work during the Great Depression. Super sad. After high school, Frank went to the University of Southern California, USC, not having any type of athletic scholarship. And actually, according to his Wikipedia, he did not have an athletic scholarship because of his super low grade point average, GPA, in high school. Fast forward some time, Frank ended up on the USC football team and was named an All-American, and ended up graduating from USC in 1952. Now, that led Frank to heading to the National Football League, and where, for time's sake, we're going to fast forward some things, he spent his entire career with the New York Giants. According to Wikipedia, he was quite the decorated player. He appeared in 8 Pro Bowls. He appeared in 5 NFL championship games, which was before they started calling it the Super Bowl. He won the league's most valuable player in 1956. And at that same year, they won the championship game against the Chicago Bears. A few years later, in 1960, Frank was tackled by a player on the Eagles, which, according to Wikipedia, they say it is, quote, widely considered the hardest defensive hit, or one of the hardest, in the history of the NFL, and is often referred to simply as the hit, end quote. He retired a few years later in 1964, and in 1977, he was inducted into the Hall of Fame. After his playing days, he shifted into broadcasting and had a really long run with doing that. As well known as he is from his playing days, he is equally as well known for his broadcasting days. In 1977, Frank even won an Emmy Award for Outstanding Sports Personality. And something else I wanted to mention, because it's kind of a funny connection to my last name, is in 1995, Frank was given the Pete Rozelle Radio Television Award. Now, when I read that on Wikipedia, I laughed because I occasionally get asked if I'm related to Pete Rozelle. And I think my dad told me at one time that my grandpa or someone claims that we're related in some way. I mean, I'm not sure if that's a dream, a joke, reality. Nonetheless, I personally do not consider myself to be related to him. I don't know him. Finally, in regards to him more personally speaking, Frank's first marriage to a lady named Maxine was his college sweetheart. And together, they ended up having 3 children, Jeffrey, Kyle, and Victoria. Frank and Maxine divorced, and Frank remarried, but it also ended in a divorce. And shortly after that, Frank ended up meeting and later marrying Kathy, and together they had 2 children, Cody and Cassidy. Frank and Kathy remained married until Frank's death in 2015. Now, his death came as a bit of a shock. Frank died on August 9th, 2015 from natural causes. It was later reported by the family in November 2015 that Frank had been suffering from CTE, so chronic traumatic, I'm going to butcher it, encephalopathy, I think is how they say it. CTE, which is often kind of associated with football. Anyway, the family shared, quote, After losing our beloved husband and father, we as a family made the difficult decision to have his brain studied in hopes of contributing to the advancement of medical research concerning the link between football and traumatic brain injury. We decided to disclose our loved one's condition to honor Frank's legacy of promoting player safety dating back to his involvement in the formation of the NFL Players Association in the 1950s, end quote. That's just a really incredible thing that they did, and I'm certain it was such a difficult decision. So, shifting to what happened after Frank passed away. According to page 6, which is, of course, in the source links for this episode, Frank passed away with an estate of around $10 million dollars and passed away with a last will and testament as his estate plan. And you know what that means if you're a faithful legal tea listener, and that's that the will is public record. So many news outlets found the will online through the Connecticut probate records, which Connecticut was where he was living at the time of his death. And those news reports, those news outlets reported on the will's contents. So they're very readily available, I guess is what I'm saying. So let's dive in. From the will, his wife, Kathy, was listed as the executor. As executor, Kathy was, of course, tasked with distributing Frank's assets, his estate, according to his will. And his will left his assets a little something like this. First, Jeffrey and Victoria, children from his first marriage, received $500,000 each. And they appear to have been given their inheritance outright, which means that they just got their share with no strings attached. Second, his other child from his first marriage, Kyle, was unfortunately very seriously injured in a car accident. So Frank left him $1 million and did so in trust for him, which was to be managed by Kathy. So Kathy kind of holds the purse strings for Kyle's inheritance, kind of what comes out of the trust. Next, the will gives $300,000 to the family's former nanny, Christine. And I think I read somewhere that she ended up turning into Kathy's personal assistant or something. But anyways, he put a stipulation on that $300,000 and said that if there were any loans that were made to Christine, which were still unpaid, those loan balances are to be deducted from that $300,000 or paid back to the estate. Now, that sounds like to me that he or they had loaned Christine some money, which is fine and dandy. He just wouldn't put that kind of provision in there if there were, no loans, Really, the rest of Frank's assets and estate went to Kathy, including the home they lived in and where he ended up dying in Connecticut, as well as another house that they had in Key Largo. All of everything went to Kathy after those monetary amounts I just talked about. Now, something to note too is that Frank and Kathy's children, Cody and Cassidy, did not get anything from him, Dad, when Frank died. But the will says that Kathy's passing, they are set to receive the remaining estate and fortune. So I think they'll be just fine. Now, many of the reports I read regarding Frank's estate kept talking about how Frank's first three children, Jeffrey, Victoria, and Kyle, were not as favored as much as Frank's late wife, Kathy, and their shared children, Cody and Cassidy. Many of the articles mentioned that the three original children got a combined $2 million compared to Kathy and sort of Cody and Cassidy, who represent the remaining $8 million. We could sit here and speculate all day, but I did not see any reports that the first three children kicked up a fuss or tried to fight. So while the reports and articles make it seem like a big deal, it wasn't a big deal enough for the original three children to try and contest anything. Or maybe they just decided it wasn't worth it and just to move on. Who knows? Though I'm happy to report I didn't see anything about family fighting, which I hate to say it, but blended families like this are sometimes just a bit more ripe to fight. But they didn't, and that's awesome. I think it's actually a great takeaway from Frank's episode here. Whether we want to admit it or not, blended families pose some unique considerations when embarking on an estate planning process. And actually, I should back up. Blended families, it is important to just even get a plan in place. Trying to say, oh, they'll just figure it out when I'm dead is likely going to be a recipe for disaster. There's a lot of emotions, a lot of opinions, and sometimes they go unsaid for a long time. So, yeah, if you're part of a blended family, please, oh, please let this episode serve as an encouragement to get your plan done. Then, when you embark on the planning process, just know that there are a lot of options and abilities to take care of everyone in a very methodical and an intentional way to hopefully promote family harmony after you pass away. And if they do not kumbaya now, at least having a good plan will hopefully not pour gas on the fire, if you know what I mean. And one final thing, and something that I was surprised no one talked about, and none of the research that I did, is there was there was the mention that he had a property in Connecticut and Key Largo, Florida. And often when you have properties in multiple states like that, it is typically advantageous to utilize trust planning so that the estate does not have to go through the Connecticut probate process and the Florida probate process. Many everyday people who have properties in more than one state elect to do trust planning to eliminate having to do probate in more than one state. And maybe that happened with Frank and he just had enough money that it didn't really matter to have those extra fees of going through probate in two states. But I wanted to mention that as part of this podcast episode because that's a big concern for a lot of my clients that have properties in multiple states. Having to go through probate in not one, but in two states and more if there are properties in more than two states nearly always pushes people into trust planning to avoid that. So I just figured I should mention that. Let's wrap up this episode and shift to a sneak peek of next week. Next week, we are back to a cautionary tale episode where we talk about real life clients, real life cases that I or my office have worked on, or maybe they're just generally good things to know and be aware of so that you don't slip up and turn into a cautionary tale one day. Next week, we're going to talk about how the holidays are approaching. Somehow we're near the end of the year. Holidays are coming at us really quickly. And what do many of us do around the holidays? We get together with family and loved ones and friends. And some of those we will see and visit, we may not have seen them in a bit. And you may notice that mom, dad, aunt, grandma, grandpa, whoever has declined since you last saw them. And now you're concerned. So I wanted to do the episode next week to share some tools and resources and tips and tricks for how to deal with this, how to deal with noticing your family member or loved one's declining health. So tune in for that next week. But until then, Legal Tea listeners, take care and be well.